Alright, let's get started. Go back to where we were. We were roughly right here, but maybe let's reset up Aristotle's physics really quick. Aristotle's physics in particularly talking about change. Relative to change, Aristotle talks about four causes. We remember the four causes?
Yeah.
The four factors that go into every change?
There's the material.
The material cause.
The formal and the final.
Oh wow, good job. Yep, material, we don't need to write them out. There's a material cause. What's roughly the material cause?
What it's made out of.
What it's made of.
Yeah, what the change is coming out of. That's the material cause. The efficient cause.
I don't remember.
It's how you do it.
It's the actor responsible for the change. So if we were talking about a sculpture, that would be the sculptor along with his tools.
Oh, okay.
The final cause.
Is why we made it like this.
No.
What it's for.
Oh, which one did I just say?
The final.
Oh, you're right. The final cause is that for the sake of which the change occurs, and then what I meant to say, the formal cause. What's the formal cause?
It's.
Isn't that shape it took?
Well, it's
Yes, it's the form it's changed into. So your matter is your initial form. Your formal cause, your material cause is your initial form. Your formal cause is the form it has at the end of the change. The efficient cause is who causes the change. And the final cause is the purpose behind the change. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And so we roughly talked about three types of changes we see in the universe. Talked about artificial changes, brought about by a human being. And then it was pretty simple to identify the four causes in those cases. And then we talked about living changes. Something like your skin scabbing was one example that we talked about. And even with your skin scabbing, we could still kind of name the four causes. What produces the cause? Your blood, and whatever else is mixed in your blood that actually does the clotting. What's the formal cause? The actual clot there. What's the efficient cause? Whatever the enzymes in your blood are that cause the clotting to occur. And then what was the final cause? Maybe to stop the bleeding, to keep disease out, stuff like that. The purpose that it serves. And oftentimes in biology, we reference things by their purpose. What's the purpose of the heart? What's the purpose of the lungs? Anytime we talk about an organ, we talk about relative to a purpose. So the weird one in all this physics, let's talk about natural changes. Like a tree falling, hitting a rock, rolling it down a hill. What was the material, formal, final cause, and efficient cause, and all that? Now, most of them make perfect sense except for the final cause. That was the only confusing one. Whose purpose was behind that? Remember the answer to whose purpose is behind the rock rolling down the hill?
It wanted to get closer.
Yes, the rock's purpose. It has its natural resting place at the center of the universe.
Yeah.
And so it's built into that rock to desire to be at the center of the universe. And for whatever reason, it's just a fact of the universe that, left to its own devices, all the four elements, terrestrial elements, the ones we have around us, can only move up and down of their own accord. They can't move side to side.
Mm-hmm.
That takes some outside actor. And so that rock really wants to fall, but couldn't get down the hill until that tree bumped it to the side, and then finally it could roll down the hill. So the tree gave a little bit of side motion, and it gave itself the down motion, because that's where it wants to be.
Yeah.
Make sense? So let's just look at one previous slide. Remember what we were talking about? So we were talking about, okay, what does Aristotle's universe look like? He was arguing why the earth was at the center of the universe. Arguing why the earth was at the center of the universe, and he gave his argument here. Do you remember his argument for why he didn't think that the earth was going around the sun, but rather the sun was going around the earth?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he pointed out is we don't notice a parallax. You remember what a parallax is? When I have side-to-side motion, when I'm over here, Jeremy looks like he's to the right of my hand. When I'm over here, Jeremy looks like he's to the left of my hand. My hand's not moving, Jeremy's not moving, it's just my head that's moving. So if the earth was going from side to side in a 12-hour period, we would expect in that 12-hour period the night sky to look completely different. This star here, when the sun's over here, looks like it's on the right side of the shell star. When it's over here, it looks like it's on the left side of the shell star. So here's roughly what the night sky looks like over here. Here's roughly what it looks like over there. But it's a matter of record that the night sky always has been and always will be looking exactly how it looks to these guys. So we don't know if the star is looking completely different relative to each other at one time of day versus another. They always just look the same. Make sense? Okay, so now we're going to get into that's his argument for the sun goes around the earth, not the earth goes around the sun. And then we'll get into a couple of his arguments for why he thought the earth was at the center of the universe. Before I did that, I put this picture in here because it's where I could fit it. Should have referenced this when it came up. I told you that Aristotle thought that the further... Now remember that things that aren't terrestrial, so the moon, the planets, the stars, these aren't composed of the 4 terrestrial elements. These are composed of ether, the 5th element, which likes to move circular. And Aristotle thought that it just appealed to his intuition that the further away an ethereal object is from the earth, the more perfectly circular its motion should be. Right?
Yep.
And so the weird thing about that was, the stars looked like they moved in perfect circles, the sun looked like it moved in perfect circles, and the moon looked like it moved in perfect circles. But Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn had these weirder orbits relative to the Earth. And does it make sense why their orbits are weird relative to the Earth?
Yeah.
Roughly speaking, how could I draw this? Oh, there's no way I can make this work. Trying to get a rough idea. So here's what's actually going on in the solar system. So here's the Earth, and then we'll look at something like Mercury. So here's Mercury's orbit. Let's say that the Earth is moving this way, and that, how can I make this make sense? Notice that over here, Mercury moves this way relative to the Earth, and over here, Mercury looks like it moves this way relative to the Earth.
Yeah.
Because Mercury is going around the sun like this. Actual picture of our solar system for a second. You with me?
Mm-hmm.
So the weird thing about this is from the Earth's perspective, sometimes it looks like Mercury is moving this way, sometimes it looks like it's moving that way. And so sometimes it looks like it regresses in its patterns. And so if you were to plot what that looks like relative to the Earth, if you assumed that the Earth was at the center of the universe, that would roughly look like Mercury was doing this in its orbit, which is not very circular. That's it from the Earth's perspective, Mercury's orbit. And so, it wasn't Aristotle who came up with this exact model that we're looking up. It was Ptolemy, someone shortly after Aristotle, or at least it was done under the... What's it called? When someone funds your research for you. Sponsorship, that's not quite what I'm looking for, but we'll go with it. The sponsorship of Ptolemy, I'm not sure, I don't think he actually did it, or if it was a mathematician named Ptolemy, or if it was one of the Ptolemies in Egypt and he just sponsored the mathematician that did it. But using Aristotle's basic idea of here's what's going on in the universe, just fleshing it out more, the way that they thought it worked, relatively close to Aristotle's time, this isn't quite his model, but it was close to what he would have said, is that these must be moving in circles while they're moving in circles. So you have the moon just moves in a circle, and then Mercury is moving in a circle while it's moving in a circle around the Earth. So it has a small circle that's moving in, while it has its larger orbit, which kind of gives them what they expected. Yeah. And same with all the planets. And as their measurements got better and better, this is fast forwarding 1,000 years, they realized, that didn't quite work. So they thought maybe while Saturn here is going in this circle, not only is it going in this circle, but it's also going in a little circle around that circle as it goes in circles. They really were connected with this idea that these things have to be going in some sort of circular motion. It took a long time to get a leap past that. And I'm not sure how many concentric circles they went through, because then they looked at that and says, that doesn't quite work. Maybe it's going in circles while it's going in circles while it's going in circles while it's going in circles. And it got more and more convoluted until a guy by the name of Kepler came along and says, no, it's just going in an ellipse, not a circle, which is roughly 2,000 years after Aristotle. So this is roughly the picture of what's going on before Copernicus and Kepler come on the scene. Copernicus comes on and says, no, the Earth's at the center, the Earth's spinning, and it takes a year to go around the sun. And then Kepler comes along and says, and the planets aren't going in circles around circles around circles, they're just traveling in ellipses. So that's a picture of the solar system for almost 2,000 years by human standards. Make sense?
Yeah.
So let's roughly get a picture of Aristotle's view, or not roughly get a picture. Let's look at some of Aristotle's arguments for why he thought that the Earth. No, we already have his arguments for why the Earth's at the center of the universe. Now we need to look at for his arguments why he thought the Earth was a sphere. This is one more thing he argued about the Earth. He thought the Earth had to be a sphere. And he had 4 basic arguments for why he thought the Earth was a sphere. Number 1, just think about his model for how the elements work. If I have a bunch of rock floating around in space and then some things of water floating around in space, and if we take his model of the universe, that it's all going to fall towards the center, that would naturally produce a sphere with water around it, right?
Yeah.
So just based off of his physics, his laws of motion, it already makes perfect sense to him, theoretically, that the Earth should be a sphere. So that's one reason he thought it. He thought he knew how to explain motion. His model for explaining motion results in the Earth being a sphere. So that's one reason he thought that the Earth was a sphere. Reason number 2 he thought the Earth was a sphere is because it would cast a shadow on the moon during an eclipse. So you have the sun here, you have the Earth here, and then you have the moon here. And the sun casts a shadow of the Earth onto the moon.
Yeah.
And he says every time this happens, it's casting a perfectly circular shadow onto the moon. So either the Earth, maybe it's some disc shape that happens to always be perfectly lined up, so it casts a circular shadow on the moon and it's never tipped a little bit, or the Earth is a sphere, and there's no chance about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I had a second argument for why he thought this. This one had to do with just watching ships come in from the harbor. You watch a ship come in from the harbor, you can see the mast of the ship before you can see the hull of the ship. Why could you see that? Because the ocean must be slightly curved. And so it's actually going up in elevation. His third, which is probably his strongest argument, has to do with what the night sky looks like based off of your position on the Earth. So let's draw 2 simple models of what potentially the Earth could look like. We'll use a flat earther version and then an Aristotelian version.
Okay.
So a flat earther version, if the Earth's a flat disk, and then you have the stars on a sphere over here, right? So we have a star here, star here, star here, star here. Doesn't matter if you're right here on the Earth, if you're right here on the Earth, or if you're right here on the Earth. If you look at this horizon, you always see these same stars. You with me? Now, if you replace that with a spherical version of the Earth, then when you're right here on the Earth and you look at the horizon, you can only see these stars. But if you're right here on the Earth and you look at this horizon, you can now see all those stars. And so your position on the Earth dictates the stars that you can see on the horizon. Therefore, the Earth must be round. So, another argument of his. Now, as you can see, his arguments often make reference to facts of the universe rather than, wouldn't it be nice if?
Yeah.
Mention the spheres. Oh, I already did mention the spheres. When I mean mention the spheres, remember that they don't view the stars as being a bunch of individual particles out there in space orbiting the Earth. All the stars are embedded in one big sphere. So here's a big sphere, here's the Earth, and there's stars fixed in that sphere. This sphere has an axis of rotation, and it's just orbiting. The sphere is just spinning. So the star right here never moves, the star right here never moves. The star right here orbits around like that, and the star right here moves a lot, orbiting all the way around. It's a spinning sphere. Make sense?
Yeah.
And same thing for all of these. You view them as spheres with the planets or the sun and the moon embedded in them somehow. And it's an orbiting sphere. It's not a body, it's not an object in space orbiting on its own. Make sense? Okay, so I think that gets us pretty well back up to date. And that kind of finishes off Aristotle's physics. That's roughly his picture of the universe. We just wanted to go through it roughly. So now we've done it. We've explained change. So it appears that in every change, there's a final cause. The first 3 causes are pretty simple. It was the final cause that threw us for a loop. Okay, we've now explained the final cause in every change we see in the universe. A purpose for the sake of which the change occurs, the final cause. everything in the universe seems to be striving towards some final end. Right? Make sense? So, now, one of the people he's opposed to is the atomists in their view of the world. Plato wouldn't have taken much issue with this. It's the atomists who would have taken issue with this. The atomists thought that there were just atoms in the void, and that was just chemicals in motion randomly bouncing around, bouncing around, bouncing around. And so they would have been the types of people to take the biggest issue with Aristotle saying everything in the universe is happening for some purpose, that there's ultimate purpose behind everything. They say, no, it's just all random chance. It's just atoms in motion. And so Aristotle has a criticism of that. So he says, besides, maybe throw my model out, let's look at the other model that's being proposed in my day. Besides, how would the atomists, who claim that there is no purpose and that everything that occurs is just a chance event, how would they account for the uniformity in the universe? So Aristotle notices very peculiar things. Every time you plant an acorn, or almost every time, for the most part when you plant an acorn, it produces an oak. It never produces a maple. Why not? If it's just random chance. So he says this uniformity in the universe, the fact that things keep consistently happening the way that they do, given a particular thing, it consistently evolves a particular way, means that there must be some purpose happening somewhere. This can't just be all chance events. It's not just pure randomness. So there has to be more than that, otherwise we'd see purely random things happening all the time, and we don't. For the most part, our universe seems very orderly, very uniform, seems to follow very basic rules. And you can grasp those rules and you can start making predictions about the universe, which tend for the most part to be true. So in all natural change, everything is striving to get where it's ultimately going. And so in this sense, the formal cause and the final cause are the same thing. So trying to wrap our heads around this, and examples would probably help. So we plant the acorn. Now let's think about an acorn becoming an oak. And let's go through the four causes. We plant the acorn in the ground, and it starts to become an oak. First off, the material cause. That's obviously an acorn.
Yeah.
The efficient cause, well, that's the person planting in the ground, the watering, doing the watering, everything that goes into taking care of an acorn. Whoever's doing all the upkeep. Now, the final cause, if we look at it becoming an oak, is the oak. Right?
Yeah.
Now, what is the... Sorry, that's the formal cause. Keep mixing those up. Did I say final? I think I said final. I meant formal. The formal cause, what we end up with, is an oak. But what's the final cause? What was the purpose? Why did the acorn become an oak? To become an oak. That's ultimately what it's striving for. It's trying to actualize its full potential. Why does a baby develop into a full-grown man? To develop into a full-grown man. That's what it's striving to do. As it's becoming more and more developed, more and more actualized, the purpose of a baby developing into a grown man is to develop into a grown man. The purpose of an acorn becoming an oak is to become an oak. So the formal cause and the final cause are the same thing if we look at the formal cause at the very end of the chain. We can look at a bunch of material causes and formal causes as it's incrementing the growth of the acorn into an oak. But if we look at it start to finish, then the formal and final cause become one and the same thing. That's what was ultimately reaching for, to become an oak. That's its ultimate purpose in life. The ultimate purpose of an acorn, become an oak.
So why does he split it into four causes if they're basically the same thing?
They happen to be the same thing when humans aren't involved. When a sculptor produces a statue, the formal cause and the final cause are not the same thing. If Peter goes and he chisels a piece of marble into a statue, the formal cause is whatever the statue is. Maybe you carve a statue of Plato. When it's all said and done, what do you have? A statue of Plato. That's the formal cause. What was the final cause? Maybe you need to sell it to make a living.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to immortalize Plato. Maybe you're just practicing your skills. Who knows? But the point is, those are not the same thing those are not necessarily the same thing in human action.
Okay.
So, artificial action, they're not necessarily the same thing. Natural action, natural change, they are the same thing. So similarly, when we had, what was the other example? A more physical one. The rock fell to the ground. why does a rock fall to the ground? To fall to the ground. So that's both its formal and final cause. If I grab a rock and drop it, we look at its material cause, it's a rock right here. We look at its formal cause, it's a rock down here.
Okay.
And its final cause, why did it fall to the ground? To get to the ground. That's naturally where it wanted to be. So in natural change, whether we're talking about biological or more physical, the formal and final cause are one and the same. Not necessarily the case with artificial change. Make sense? Okay. So, what we've just explained is that Aristotle is a universal teleologist. He believes that there is ultimately purpose behind all action and change. Everything happens for a reason. Everything happens for a purpose. There's a purpose behind all change. You can say that however you want. Now, Aristotle does not believe in perfect determinism. So when he has these laws in mind of how the universe operates, he thinks that there's still exceptions to the rules. He notices that if I go plant 100 acorns in the ground, maybe only 99 of them will become oaks. And so sometimes, no matter how hard you try, some changes just don't take. Sometimes the natural rules that are supposed to be followed, it seems like there's exceptions. And the exceptions are random. So he thought inherently built into our universe was some randomness that you can't account for. And that no matter how perfectly you try to set up the initial conditions, that doesn't guarantee the ultimate end. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So contrast this with our regular physics. Our regular physics, if I take this object and I start it right here, perfectly right here, and I give it exactly a velocity of 10 meters per second exactly that way, then every single time it will land exactly right here. And I can make all those calculations. And we would never expect there to be an exception. Aristotle's view of the universe is that might be true 99.99999% of the time, but there could be an exception. It's possible. That's built into his worldview. That exceptions just happen to sometimes seem to occur. And that there's no way for us to explain the exceptions. And I don't know if this is what gave him some of his wiggle room for like free will in the universe. Because a lot of the time if you have perfect determinism, that also throws out free will. Everything you're going to do is already predetermined. You're a part of the universe just like a chair. Anyways, so he didn't believe in perfect determinism and thinks that there's still chance factors that could prevent an object from becoming fully actualized. Sometimes an acorn doesn't become an oak. This leads Aristotle to think of natural laws as happening always or for the most part. Always or for the most part. And that it's possible the exceptions may never be fully understood. So maybe our science will just get really, really good at describing how the universe is most of the times, but he's perfectly content with maybe there's no such thing as perfect understanding of how our universe functions. The best explanation Aristotle has for the exceptions is to say that the form somehow was prevented from actualizing by its matter. Somehow the matter was resistive to taking on the new form. And this hints a little bit of Plato. If you remember Plato's view of how our universe came into existence. The world of forms tried to impose itself on the void, us, this world, but matter, this world, somehow resisted. And so that's his explanation for why there's evil in the universe. Evil in the universe is matter resisting it, being resistive to taking on those perfect forms. So in Plato's view, there's no such thing as evil in and of itself. Evil is just a lack of good. An evil shadow is a shadow that's not a perfect shadow of you. And the worse the shadow is, the more evil it is, using Plato's way of talking. So this kind of hints a little bit back to Plato with somehow the matter was just resistive to the form, and that's what enables these chance events to occur.
Okay.
Don't know how much to make out of that. But now, with all these together, we can see a few of the reasons why Aristotle was so hated and is still kind of hated by a lot of scientists. One, he talks about laws that aren't perfectly deterministic laws, but that they're only laws for the most part, which a lot of people hated. Later scientists hated, going back and reading Aristotle. Two, the fact that he makes it all teleological, which means that there's purpose behind everything, and the Christians are going to adopt that and say, yeah, and it's God's purpose that's behind everything. And so modern scientists hate the Christian church, as a general rule. And since this fed so well to the Christian church, that's another reason that they resent Aristotle. And another reason that they resent Aristotle is because if we were to look at his physics, it was wrong across the board.
Yeah.
Now, he had the right methodology for determining a lot of these things. Is that my phone? Am I hearing nothing?
Oh, it's mine.
Oh. So, doesn't matter who, one scientist says, the history of physics is proving Aristotle wrong. Right? And so, yeah, Aristotle was wrong across the board in his physics. You hardly got anything right. Most of his theories only work in very contrived situations. And so he was wrong. And so that's another reason he was so hated, because Aristotle's system was so integrated, he had a lot of false ideas in there, which led to people hanging on to Aristotle for so long, which made innovation hard. It's hard to blame Aristotle for any of that. Aristotle was always out to just make theories that accounted for the facts of the universe. He would have been the first one that would have said, your theory doesn't work with these facts, he would have said, then it must be wrong. So, a lot of irrational hatred of Aristotle. Now, viewing Aristotle's teleology, he does not have a Christian-type teleology. Remember, he's roughly 350 BC, so he's well before Christianity's on the scene. Probably doesn't even know about Jews, hardly. And so this view of a God, in the Christian sense of a God, is not in his mind. So if you have any inklings that way, you're going to misunderstand Aristotle. So Aristotle's teleology is imminent. The objects strive towards their own ends. They're not striving towards someone else's end. It's built into me to naturally strive towards my own ends. Built into the acorn is the tendency to strive to become an oak. And its purpose is somehow contained within itself. So the objects strive towards their own end, or their own self-realization, or their own self-actualization, however you want to say that. They do not strive towards some exterior cosmic end. A Christian would say God's purpose. Plato would have said the form of the good.
Yeah.
Your ultimate purpose is somehow endowed in you. And note that this sets up his metaphysical foundation for his ethics. That a man ought, as a moral obligation, a man ought to strive towards his own self-realization or his own self-actualization. So you say your opinion about what actualizes you is completely irrelevant. Here's what actualizes a human being. And you ought to actualize yourself. The same way that this is what actualizes an oak from an acorn. This is what actualizes an acorn. The acorn's opinion about what actualizes it, completely irrelevant. These are the things that do, and these are the things that don't. And so if you'll do these things, then you're more likely to end up with an oak. If you do these things, you're more likely to end up with a fully actualized human being, a fully happy human being. So that's like his foundations for his ethics there. Anyways, how do we explain now motion in the universe as such? So we know how to analyze a particular motion, but what's the ultimate cause of motion? What keeps the universe in motion? Why doesn't it ultimately wind down and stop? What is the cause of motion? Or say it one more way that might appeal to your intuition and try and confuse you just a little bit here. All change is potential being actualized, right?
Yeah.
What actualizes that potential? Can potential just actualize itself? Or does there need to be something exterior that ultimately leads to that actualization, that somehow triggers that potential to actualize itself? So Aristotle doesn't like this notion of potential just actualizing itself.
Okay.
So there needs to be some ultimate cause to a change, to motion. What causes motion in and of itself? What is the ultimate source of motion? If we follow the motion back long enough, what's the ultimate source of that motion? Which led this to actualize, and this to actualize, and this to actualize, and this to actualize. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's what he's after when he's trying to explain motion as such. Motion qua motion. Now, when we say what causes motion in the universe, we do not mean what was the first motion in time. You might think, well, go back to the beginning of the universe and there was this event which caused this event, and this event, this event, this event just triggers a web of events forever from there on out, right?
Yeah.
Now, Aristotle's view of the universe is still that it is eternal. It always has been and always will be. The heavens are never changing. They always have been and always will be. And now, since the universe is eternal, so, well, what's the best way to say this? Aristotle believes in an eternal universe, and so motion always existed. Here's where I'm getting to the argument a little bit more. So time is simply the measure of motion. That's the way Aristotle defines time. Time is the measure of motion. How do we measure 1 year? 1 year is the measure of the Earth going around the sun. We measure in terms of some sort of motion. How do we measure 1 day? 1 day is the Earth making one rotation. The Earth spins around 360 degrees. We call that a day. A motionless universe for Aristotle would be a timeless universe. Right? So, to speak about a time in the universe where there was no motion, to Aristotle that's as absurd as speaking about a time in the universe where there was no time. When in the universe was there no time? That's when there was no motion. Which was never.
Yeah.
It's contradiction. So, therefore, motion is also eternal. As all, there is no first motion in this sense. But we still have a bunch of potentials being actualized. What is ultimately actualizing these potentials? How do we explain this? So, in looking for the cause of motion, we are looking for the ultimate and eternal source of motion in the universe. What keeps these potentials actualizing? Now, whatever this ultimate source of motion is, W-I-L-L, will call, that's right. We'll call the mover, and it's what Aristotle's going to ultimately call the mover, the prime mover. So whatever this ultimate source of motion is, let's think about what its properties have to be at least, and then maybe we can get a sense of what this thing should be. Okay. Now, what properties must this mover have? First off, it must be eternal in and of itself, since its motion is eternal. Motion is eternal, it's the ultimate source of motion, so it itself has to be eternal. There was never a time without motion. This is the ultimate source of motion, so it itself has to be eternal. Follow that? Okay. It must be unmoved and immovable. Movement would be a type of motion. It can't move itself, otherwise we have potential actualizing itself all over again. And then that's an infinite regress. Right?
Yeah.
It's like begging the question. To have the mover able to not only cause movement in the universe, but cause movement in itself. So, the cause of motion can itself move. Otherwise, we haven't gotten anywhere. So, it must be unmoved and immovable. If the mover moves, what explains its motion? That was a good way of saying it. It must have no potentiality. Here's a weird one. It must have no potentiality. Otherwise, it would have to move to actualize itself. Everything in the universe tries to actualize itself. Right? Which would be a change in motion. Since this thing has no motion, it must have no potentiality. Otherwise, it would undergo motion to actualize itself. So this is the one exception to our statement that everything in the universe is both form and matter. It has both potentiality and actuality. This thing here has to be purely actuality, no potentiality.
So it doesn't have matter in a sense?
Yeah, I think that's my next point that I was going to link to it. So, has no potential, so it's pure actuality. It must not be physical, otherwise it have matter, and therefore potentiality. But he says it has no potentiality, it's pure actuality. So it's pure form, no matter. It must be perfect. It's better to be actualized than to just be potential, and it's completely actualized. That's what we mean for something to become perfect, to become more and more actualized, until you can't actualize it anymore. And it is as much what it is as it could be. It's perfect. Fully actualized. So these are the properties that this unmoved mover must have. And once again, this is going to be what later theologians convert into the Christian God, but Aristotle does not have any of that in mind. This isn't necessarily personage yet.
And he says there's something out there that exists that makes stuff move.
There has to be some mover that has these properties. So far, that's what we got.
Okay.
He gives more than that. So we'll explain more about this mover. Now, how does such a mover cause motion? Notice that our mover is one that cannot move, has no will, and cannot desire. Right? When you will towards your actualization, or when you desire, it's to be more actualized. It's fully actualized. It has no will, has no desires. It can't move. How on earth could something like this be responsible for movement in the universe? You can't push it, can't pull it, can't drag it. How is our mover, with the properties that we've listed, able to bring about any motion in the universe?
Okay.
Now, going back to our picture of the universe, remember that the universe is ultimately nested spheres. We have the outermost sphere, the stars, and then we have Saturn's sphere, Jupiter's sphere, etc., all the way down, right? It's a bunch of nested spheres. That's what the universe looks like. On top of this, it is thought that there is some sort of intelligence attached to each of these spheres.
Ether, right?
No, intelligence, as in like demigods type things.
Okay. Did we go over that?
Now, this is the first time we're introducing this.
Okay.
So very much endowed in Greek thought is the notion that there's some intelligence attached to these perfectly spherical moving things that are moving in this perfectly spherical motion. Not necessarily human intelligence, something more divine, something grander than human intelligence. And so basically demigods, and a lot of gods in mythology get their names from these exact things. Apollo comes from the sun. Mercury, that's just, what was his Greek name?
Aries.
We-
No.
Mercury's Hermes.
Mercury's is Hermes. Yeah, there we go. Mars is Aries. Jupiter is Zeus,
Yeah.
etc. And so, it's thought that there's some sort of intelligence attached with these spheres. And so they have some sort of awareness, these spheres. Okay?
Awareness. Okay.
Some sort of awareness. What exactly they're aware of, how they're aware of things, what their sensory organs look like, we wouldn't even dare to guess.
What's his argument for them possessing intelligence?
For their perfect motion. And they're continually keeping themselves in this almost perfectly spherical motion.
And so therefore they have
Eternal
intelligence.
motion, yeah. Some sort of intelligence attached with him, and it's also just like stewed in his culture. Like if I were to ask you, why do you think the earth goes around the sun? Because a whole lot of people have been telling you that your whole life.
Yeah.
You've never charted the stars, you've never tried to do a proof. You just accept it because you've been drowning in it since you came into an educational institution. So, he's been drowned in it and heard whatever arguments they had in the day for why they thought it. But he doesn't have some great, I talked to Mars once, and so I know, nothing like that.
Interesting. Okay.
But so some sort of awareness, some sort of intelligence he attaches to these spheres. They must have some sort of intelligence. How else could they continually maintain such a perfect course and continually do this forever, eternally? So Aristotle thought that all motion was ultimately communicated along these spheres, going from the outermost sphere inward. So motion is somehow communicated by the stars to Saturn, who somehow communicates it to Jupiter, who somehow communicates it inwards, 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 all the way reaching to the earth. Now, communicates is kind of a rough word here, but its motion can somehow have an effect. It's some motion that then has an effect on this, that then has an effect on this. It can be communicated in the sense that some activity happens in the clouds which creates a lightning bolt which strikes a tree trunk, which causes the tree to fall over, which hits a rock, which causes it to roll down the hill. And the motion was communicated through that chain of events. Make sense?
Yeah, I see what he's getting at. Like,
That's what we mean.
okay.
So somehow it's communicated along the spheres all the way ultimately to the center of the earth. So somehow all motion is originated, the original motion is somehow originated outside the universe, outside this outermost sphere. And so outside this outermost sphere is where we have the sphere of the prime mover.
Prime mover.
The prime mover. The prime mover exists out here, outside the sphere of the stars.
Okay.
Okay? And so, let's see what I had here. Aristotle thought that all motion was ultimately communicated along these spheres, going from the outermost spheres inwards. And an example of this, the motion of the sun causes a plant to move, right? That's one way that we see motion from exterior to us, communicating motion here. The sun moves and somehow that causes the plant to move. Or the moon moves and that somehow causes tides to move. You can tie a lot of things to the motion of the sun. Right? The sun suddenly comes out and so that somehow causes bats to start flying out because the sun moved somewhere.
Okay.
So that's how we see this communicating motion. It's not necessarily talking. Or the motion of the sun comes out, which causes water to move upwards, evaporate into the clouds, and then it gathers up and falls back down. Ultimately, that was caused by the motion of the sun. If the sun never came out, that wouldn't have happened. So motion seems to be communicated outwards, inwards. Nothing you do affects the sun. A lot of what the sun does affects you. And then out here's our prime mover. So we're still left with the big question. How does this prime mover, well, let's see what I have here. Thus, if we can explain the motion of the outermost sphere, the sphere of the fixed stars, we can explain motion as such. Oh, so I had a graphic here. So here's our model of the universe. And he puts the prime mover existing outside the fixed stars. Hopefully you can read that.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter, it's basically the exact same picture. So the intelligence is connected with the outermost sphere. The intelligence is connected with the outermost sphere, with the sphere of the stars. Maybe I'll just do this picture. We're talking about this intelligence here right now. That intelligence is somehow aware of the prime mover. And so, as to emulate the prime mover's perfection, it engages in perfect circular motion. So, the intelligence attached with the fixed stars is aware of the prime mover, not vice versa. The prime mover is not aware of it. It's aware of the prime mover and wants to emulate the prime mover. And so, in an attempt to emulate the perfection of the prime mover, moves in perfect circular motion. And then that motion is communicated inwards to the inner spheres. The mover itself is not aware of the sphere, but the sphere is aware of the prime mover. And I listened to one guy give a wonderful example of how this type of motion might work to help give you an example. So his example was to give you a sense of how, without any motion and without any awareness, this prime mover can get the fixed stars to move. And his example was, imagine that you were at some party, some big event, and you took just a drop-dead, gorgeous, beautiful woman, and you stuck her in there, and made her oblivious to the people around her. He says that you would watch as she caused movement of a bunch of guys in the crowd to move towards her. She's completely unaware of them, right? But it's their awareness of her beauty, her perfection, that draws them towards her. And so that was his example of how something motionless and completely unaware, some intuition, could cause motion in something that was aware. So the prime mover, completely unaware of the fixed stars, the sphere of the fixed stars, but the inverse is not the case. And so it's in trying to emulate the perfection of the prime mover that the fixed stars move, which causes all motion ultimately in the universe.
Seems like he's just pulling stuff out of his head.
He is! Now, what else can you do? You're trying to explain what the ultimate source of motion is. And you can kind of say, well, for us, a lot of it seems like it depends on these things out here. Maybe for them, it's obvious that it depends on these other things out here. Yeah, he's wrong a lot. Just doing the best he can with what he's got. Okay, so what is the nature of this prime mover? It has no physicality, and so it must be a mind. It's pure form. When we get into psychology, we'll get more of a sense why it's pure form then, and has no matter to it, because we're going to talk about mind is where the forms exist. You can hold abstractions in your mind that for some reason can't physically exist in the universe, right?
Yeah.
It's not hard for you to hold the form of red in your mind, but to just grab red right here, now that's really difficult. So that's why he's saying a mind, because it's pure form. Since it's a mind, what do minds do? Minds think.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So, it must think. But it must do a motionless and unchanging kind of thinking. So what could it possibly think about?
Nothing.
It can't think about nothing. Right? Because then that's not a thought. Think about nothing. So it can't think about nothing, and it can't really dwell on this universe, because this universe is changing, and that would introduce change into the prime mover. So, since it cannot think about the universe as the universe changes, the only thing it has left to think about is itself. So the prime mover is some ultimate mind sitting there thinking about itself. Perfect form, thinking about itself. And that's all it does. The prime mover is often described as thought thinking about itself. This cosmic mind is often referred to as Aristotle's God, and you can see why it's referred to as Aristotle's God.
Yeah.
But Aristotle was just trying to piece together what the ultimate source of motion must be like, what properties it must have, and he's trying to come up with what's the most reasonable way we can piece this all together. Here's what he came up with, his prime mover. And then later, in particular the Aquinas, will later combine Aristotle's view with Christianity, and which will, in large part, become the official God of the Catholic Church, once again generating more resentment against Aristotle. So you can see how this prime mover very much sets up to mix up with the Christian God, but a long ways away from what Aristotle had. Just a pure mind, only contemplating itself, completely unaware of the universe. That's all it is.
Interesting.
It is interesting. Very strange. Okay. And then I put the slide in before I found that picture that I had right there. We'll go over it one more time. Oh, no, this is something else. Sorry. So our metaphysical hierarchy now, if we were to rank being as more actualized versus less actualized, the more perfect being versus a less perfect being, so a metaphysical hierarchy, here's roughly what Aristotle's metaphysical hierarchy would look like. At the very bottom, there's prime matter. Prime matter, pure matter. Matter without form. Now this doesn't exist in the universe, but it's the most base type of concept there is. Prime matter. Okay. Now when it actually exists in the universe, it exists as one of the four basic elements, earth, water, fire, and air. So these are fundamental elements that everything are made out of. Right? We can combine these elements now together to get compounds, something that's part earth and part water, or part fire and part air. Get compounds. In particularly inorganic compounds, compounds that aren't alive. Inorganic meaning not possessing organs. That's where that ultimately comes from. And then we get to organic things. Now with organic things, Aristotle splits into plants and animals.
Yeah.
So the lowest type of living thing is plants. The next best living thing is animals. The next best living thing is man. The next best thing is the intelligence that moves the spheres, like the sun, Mercury, Venus, and then there's the prime mover. So in order of least perfect to most perfect, in terms of a metaphysical hierarchy, there it is. Give you a sense for Aristotle's metaphysics. Good?
Yeah.
Any questions about his metaphysics before we jump into his psychology?
Is his psychology just based off of his metaphysics? So it's just as convoluted as it?
Metaphysics is trying to get at being in and of itself. Psychology is an explanation of the soul.
Oh, yeah, this is where we talk about, okay.
Mind and learning and stuff like that. So yeah, quite different. This is getting closer to his epistemology. We covered most of his epistemology when we covered the organon, how human beings develop knowledge. We covered pretty much all of it, but the psychological aspect of it. And so now we're going to come back into the psychological aspect of it, and that's all we'll do for epistemology.
Okay.
Okay, so the soul for Aristotle, when we use this word soul, he uses it in a way that we might not be used to. The soul for Aristotle is the principle for life. Any living thing has a soul. And that's how he's going to use soul. will later get to mind, which mind is a part of the soul for him in man. So chances are how you're used to thinking about soul is closer to what he's going to mean by mind. I don't know. Okay, so the principle of life, any living thing has a soul. The same way that possessing manness is what makes a living thing a man. If you possess a form of manness, you are hence a man. So possessing a soul is what makes a thing a living thing.
Okay.
Right? You have something, if it possesses a soul, by definition, it's a living thing. Living thing, something that possesses a soul. Possessing a soul is an essential property of every living thing. Gets at its essence. It's not living if it doesn't have a soul. And when you kill it, it doesn't have a soul.
Yeah.
Because it's not living anymore. It's now dead. So dead things do not have souls. When you die, the soul's not there anymore. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that he didn't believe in any sort of afterlife. It's just how he's using the word soul. Okay. Since an essence makes a thing what it is, then soul is the form of any living thing, and the body is the matter of any living thing. So every living thing has as part of its form, soul, and then body obviously goes into the matter of the living thing. Another way to view it, soul, the actuality of a natural body having potentiality in it. Say that one more time. The actuality, actualizing yourself, of a natural body, any natural body out there, having life potentially in it. Actualize the life in you. That's soul. And we'll get into the three things you have to be considered a living thing, but hopefully we see what he means by soul. Some analogies to help you in case it's not clicking all the way. Soul is to body as form is to matter, as actuality is to potentiality. Aristotle's own analogy. It's like a mark stamped on wax. You know, like when you stamp an envelope? It's like a mark stamped on wax, or the capacity for vision in the eye. So the wax is the body, the stamp on it is the soul. It's the form you just apply to that wax.
Okay.
Or the eye is the body, the matter, and then the capacity for vision is its essence. That's the soul.
Yeah.
Okay. So the soul, therefore, is not independently an entity. It doesn't exist by itself. The same way that I can't take mark outside of a stamp, or outside of the wax, I can't just take the mark and leave the wax behind. The same way that I can't take vision out of the eye and say, here's vision and here's the eye. So I can't take soul out of a body. Doesn't make any sense with how he's using the words. It is simply an aspect of a living entity. The soul ceases to be when the body ceases to be living. The fundamental properties of a soul, or living thing, is essentially the ability to take in nutrition, consume things to take in nutrition, I think that makes sense, grow, and reproduce. So these are the three fundamental things that you can use to identify whether or not something has a soul.
Why reproduce?
This is just the three fundamental properties of life for Aristotle. If you want to be considered a living thing, you have to be able to do these three things. Take in nutrition, grow, reproduce.
And he doesn't explain
And-
why these three things?
Well, it's a definition. It seems to be what separates living things from non-living things. And this is even carried down into our modern notions of life. We don't consider a virus a living thing because it can't reproduce on its own. It requires a host cell. So bacteria living, virus not. What's the big difference? Virus can't reproduce itself.
We
Okay.
sure can kill them.
Well, yeah, human language, it's a wonderful thing. We can break that protein coding. Anyways, and I don't know what the current definition for life is, but I'm sure it has all three of these aspects in it somehow.
Okay.
So it's going to be close to the same thing. And then we already saw his hierarchy for living things. So anything that has a soul is a living thing. And then we saw metaphysically he had a little bit of a hierarchy for living things. So let's go through that hierarchy really quick. Plants, they just have a vegetative soul. So they are able to do these three things. They're able to reproduce, grow, take in nutrition. And that's what plants are able to do. So they're the most base living thing. Animals can do everything plants can do. But on top of that, they have mobility and sensation. Sensation meaning they have sense organs, and mobility, they can move themselves around.
Yeah.
And then humans are the highest on top of that. They don't just have a vegetative soul, they don't just have a sensitive soul, they also have a rational soul. They're capable of thought and reflection. They're capable of creating arguments and sciences.
Yeah.
So that's his hierarchy for a soul. And humans have the highest soul, animals the next type highest, and plants have the lowest type of soul that there is.
Okay.
And the human soul is obviously going to possess a mind as well. Okay, so three types of soul, there they are. This means that for Aristotle, that one, there can be no soul without body, and two, that there is no metaphysical dichotomy between the soul and the body. If you get back to views like Plato's, it's somehow the body against the soul. You have the lower elements in you, you have the higher elements in you, and the lower elements need to subject themselves to the higher elements.
Yeah.
Right? The eviler part of you is the matter part of you, the form. Well, he wouldn't have said that, that's more Aristotelian language. But the things in this universe are more evil, more corrupt versions of those perfect forms out there. And so he very much sets up, going all the way back to the Pythagoreans even, this notion of you are a soul encaged in a human body that wants to somehow escape and be free. And the body is somehow an evil thing holding you back. And you want to be beyond that body. So the body is somehow an evil and the soul's a good, and they're opposed to each other somehow. Right? So there's that dichotomy with earlier philosophers. Now Aristotle completely throws that dichotomy away with his notion of soul. The soul is a body actualizing itself when it has the potential for life. The soul can't do anything without the body. The body can't do anything without the soul. So, there's no dichotomy between the soul and the body. The two together allow a natural being to strive for its full actualization. Contrast that with Plato, which we just did. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now, Aristotle was the first to define the five senses. Taste, smell, touch, hearing. What's that? Vision.
Vision. Yeah.
Let's see if I can see it. Okay. So he was the first one to identify the five senses and to declare which organs are responsible for which of the senses. Even though now we break up the senses much more than that, the five senses, since Aristotle did it, is so built into our culture now. He believes that senses only communicate the data to us. Now, he's dealing with, in the arguments that we're going to be looking at here, he's dealing with skeptics. The skeptics, the sophists, the atomists even, who say that our senses lie to us about the way the world seems. So, one of the sophists might say, you take the 3 cups of water, you might remember going back to our 3 cups of water example. They stick their hand in the water that's freezing, and then they stick their hand in the water that's lukewarm, and they say, oh, it feels so warm. Another guy sticks his hand in boiling water, and then sticks it in the lukewarm water, and he says, oh, how cool. It's the same water, 2 completely different sensations. Our senses seem to be communicating opposite notions of how that water really is to us. Therefore, it seems like our senses can somehow lie to us or deceive us. Or another simple example is stick a pencil in water, looks like the pencil bends. It's not really bending, so our senses must be lying to us. So we can't trust the senses, we can't rely on the senses. Those types of arguments are what he has in mind when he's describing what the senses communicate. So the senses only communicate the data to us. Our senses cannot lie to us since they cannot make judgments. And only judgments are true or false. You, your soul, well, the mind in your soul, part of your soul, is what makes judgments. Your sense data never says to you, hey, this water's cold, or hey, this water's warm. Right? That's a proposition. Your senses can't put together propositions. A dog has senses. Would a dog think, oh, that water's warm and oh, that's why it's cold? Would he think those words? Would a dog ponder if that's true or false?
He wouldn't do that, but he would know whether it's...
He might have a reflex and pull his paw out and know that a pain was just triggered or a pleasant sensation was just triggered.
And then he might understand that that might be a...
Maybe there's some understanding going on, but there's never a proposition. When I see a pencil bent when you stick it in water, my eyes don't say, hey, Donnie, that pencil over there, it's bent. They just absorb photons. That data is sent to my brain, and then I make a conclusion about that. It has nothing to do with my senses.
That will make sense, but how about the water one?
How about the water one?
Yeah.
Okay, the more modern notion is one, you can feel energy leaving your hand, another one, you can feel energy going into your hand. Those are two different sensations.
Okay.
Since energy in one case is entering your hand and energy in another case is leaving your hand, you have different sensations. But it's just communicating the data to you. You're the one that made the judgment that that water must be hot or cold or warm. You have to make the judgment. Your sense organs can't make judgments. My ear can't make a judgment. My eye can't make a judgment. My tongue can't make a judgment. It can only communicate data to me, to my mind. That's where all judgments are made.
Okay.
That's what he means here. So senses only communicate the data to us. Whatever data they're receiving, that's what they communicate to us. And if the data is the photons coming off of that are coming this way like this and then this way like this, then that's the data sent to us. If we come to the conclusion that the pencil must be bent, that's our own problem. If we have a better understanding of the facts of the universe and know Snell's law, then we know, it's bending to light. The pencil is still straight. And then we come to a right conclusion versus a wrong conclusion. But we can come to a conclusion one way or another. Right?
Yeah.
It's not the senses that come to that conclusion. The senses just give us data. And they give you the data as the data is. And maybe part of the data is, hey, your sense organs are not very good. And that's part of the data. Right? If you have a bad ear, so it doesn't send sound as well to you, that's communicating information to you. Namely, that you have a bad ear. It's still communicating the facts of the universe to you. They can't lie to you. They can just give you the data, and you can use that to come to conclusions. Like, I must be going deaf. Right? So you can't blame your organs, your sense organs, for coming to a false conclusion. They're just giving you the data. You're the one that comes to a false conclusion. However, our senses do affect our perceptions. Poor eyesight, see a blur. Oh, there's a great example. Take someone who has bad eyesight, they take off their glasses, they look at something that looks like it has a blurry edge. They don't have to come to the conclusion that that must be a blurry edge. They come to the conclusion, oh, I don't have perfect 20/20 vision. Right? Pretty natural conclusion. So, quit blaming the senses. They're giving you the data. The process of sensation is a process, a type of change. Now, his way sensation happens is kind of weird, so you're going to have to follow this a little bit. A passage from potentiality to actuality. Now, sensation is a dual actualization. It's a dual change. It's a change in two places. One which occurs in the sense organ, like my eye, and one which occurs in the object being sensed. Like if I look at tomato, I think is the example I'm going to use here. So when Donnie looks at tomato, two changes happen. One in my eye, one in the tomato. The eye one might seem pretty obvious to you. The tomato, you might be wondering, how on earth? We'll get to that.
Okay.
But yes, so very interesting view of how sensation works. So when you perceive, the sense organ comes to possess the quality being sensed. When I stick my hand in really, really hot water, and then I pull my hand out and have you feel it, it feels warm. Or if I put it in cold water and have you feel it, it feels cold. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Or another example, we'll stick with the vision one. If I'm looking at a red tomato, and you come up and you look really close to my eye, you'll see that red tomato there. When I see a red tomato, that red tomato exists in my eye. You can determine what I'm seeing by just looking at my eyes.
Okay.
You see that?
Yeah.
So my eyes, when I see, my eyes actually possess the image of what I'm looking at. Or if I feel something, my skin actually possesses the sense that I am sensing. So when you perceive, the sense organ comes to possess the quality being sensed. When you feel something cold, your hand becomes cold. When you look at a red tomato, there's an image of a red tomato in your eye. So prior to the sensation, your sense organ has the potentiality to reproduce the quality being sensed. Before I stick my hand in the bucket of ice, my hand is potentially cold. It's not actually cold. Then I stick my hand in a bucket of ice and it becomes cold. Now it's actually cold.
So he's saying that this stuff, the dual actualization doesn't happen all the time, just sometimes?
No, all the time.
Okay.
You sensing is somehow taking the quality out there and making it exist again in your sense organ. When you're able to feel something cold, you reproduce cold in your hand.
Yeah, I get that.
When you see something, you reproduce the image of that thing on your eye. So, that thing, that your sense organ has a potentiality to reproduce the quality being sensed. Then, in sensing the quality, the sense organ actually reproduces the quality. And that's when you know it's being sensed. You know I'm seeing the red tomato when I actually have the red tomato existing in my eye. You know I'm sensing the coldness of the ice when my hand is actually cold. Good so far? This one should be the more intuitive of the two. How me sensing something actually produces a change in me, in my sense organ, whatever sense organ is sensing the thing.
In the sense organ.
In the sense organ.
Yes.
When my eye sees, there's actually a change in my eye.
Okay.
When my hand feels, there's actually a change in my hand. Good so far? Okay. Next one's a lot weirder. And so before we can wrap our head around how the tomato being seen also changes, we need to remind ourselves of quantitative properties versus qualitative properties. A quantitative property versus a qualitative property. Or a property that exists by nature versus a property that exists by convention. A property that exists, yes. Always, when we say convention, it's always relative to humans.
Okay.
So, we have to be very careful in the things that we're talking about because what we sense are different qualities. That's what you sense. When you see something like color.
Yeah.
When you feel something like cold, hot. Those are qualitative properties. They're not quantitative properties. I can't take a yardstick to them.
Yeah.
Your height, that's a quantitative property. Your weight, that's a quantitative property.
Okay.
So qualitative versus quantitative properties. So while quantitative properties exist in reality, they exist in nature, they don't exist by convention, qualitative properties do not. Qualitative properties are simply how quantitative properties are observed by us. I'll give you one example using a modern twist on it. Thinking about light, or color. Let's think about red for a second. Red. Where does red exist in the universe?
In our...
You might say there's such a thing as red light, right? You might be tempted to say there's red light.
Okay.
The Aristotle view to that is, no there's not. There is light traveling at this frequency, and it has this quantitative property. And the way that you experience that photon interacting with you produces what you call red. That red didn't exist in the photon. The photon is just that thing with its wave traveling at you. And the way that your mind interprets that specific frequency is red. And that's how you perceive it. The photon isn't red. The photon is of such a frequency that when it hits your eye, it reproduces red in your mind. And red existed in your mind, not in the photon in and of itself.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now, obviously Aristotle wasn't studying that because he didn't think about photons, but just trying to give you a more modern twist of something like color, which they still call a qualitative property. So, qualitative properties are simply how quantitative properties are observed by us. Quantitative property, the frequency of light. Qualitative property, it's color. We can measure the frequency, we can't measure color. Color is something that only exists in you, or me. And you can't see the color I see, and I can't see the color you see. I can look at the photons you see, you can look at the photons I see, and maybe they interpret the same way to our brains, maybe they don't. And you might be colorblind.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, the change that happens in the object. So, since redness does not exist in nature, a tomato is not red in and of itself. A tomato is composed of matter that happens to appear red to a human observer. Light happens to bounce off a tomato in such a way that it produces redness in the human eye. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense, and I think we're good. So, a tomato is not red in and of itself. It does, however, possess the potentiality for being perceived as red. Note that this is not arbitrary, as it does not have the potentiality to be observed as any other color. Meaning, it's not red to me, blue to you, and then pink to someone else. Right? You might think, oh, it can be seen as gray by someone who's colorblind, and we understand that. But we'd be very surprised to find out that someone saw it as blue or pink. So there's laws limiting how it can be perceived, but it can still only be perceived specific ways. It can't be perceived anyway. You with me so far? That's what I mean by it's not arbitrary. Its potentiality its form still dictates its potentiality. It has the potential to be perceived some ways and not to be perceived other ways. And that's dictated by its form, by the fact that it's a tomato. Tomato can only be perceived certain ways. Okay, so a tomato is not red in and of itself. It does, however, possess the potentiality for being perceived as red. Note that this is not arbitrary, as it does not have the potentiality to be observed as any other color. Then, when perception occurs, it is actually perceived as red. So it went from potentially being perceived as red to actually being perceived as red. Red is a property that it possesses in and of itself. There's no such thing as red if there's no such thing as someone perceiving red.
So the potentiality of that and the actuality of that exists all in our mind, right? In our perception.
No. The tomato has a potentiality to be observed as red by you. The redness only exists in your mind, but the potentiality to be observed as red by you exists in the tomato in and of itself. It had that potentiality because you can see it as red. So it must have been possible for you to see it as red.
Okay. I still don't get that. How
Change is going from potentiality to actuality.
Okay.
Redness only exists in your mind.
Yeah.
You can potentially view a tomato as red. If you're not looking at a tomato, you can potentially view it as being red.
Okay.
When you look at it, now you're actually viewing it as being red. So it went from potentially being red to actually being red.
Yeah, but that redness exists in your mind.
Right, but that's what we always mean by color. When we say that object is red, that's loose speech for the way that I perceive light bouncing off that object is red to me. That's what we mean by that object is red.
Okay. Okay.
So that's what it always means when we call something a color, which is what we were trying to point out before. So you go from potentially having the tomato in your eye to actually having the tomato in your eye, and the tomato goes from potentially being red to actually being red. So there's this dual actualization going on, both in you and in the object being perceived. So it's a weird type of dual change happening here in perception.
Okay.
Now, the objects of sense come in two kinds. Those that are proper to a particular sense. What I mean by that is sound can only be, I guess you can kind of feel sound with your hand. Vision can only be seen by the eye. Taste can only be tasted by the tongue. Whether or not something is cold can only be felt by your skin, or however you want to classify that sense. The objects of sense come in two types. Those that are proper to a particular sense, such as color, and those that are perceptible by more than one sense, such as motion. So how do you detect motion You probably had the experience, you've been standing there and you heard someone come up behind you. Motion was communicated to you by your hearing. Or someone actually walks towards you. In that case, motion is communicated by your sense. Or you feel something, you go to grab your pencil and you feel it roll away and you grab it. Then now it's communicated to you by your touch. So motion is one of these things that are communicated to us by multiple senses. Many senses can communicate motion to us. And so those types of objects are called common sensible.
Common sensible, okay.
Yeah. You see where we're getting our root for common sense. Although there is no special organ for detecting common sensible things, there is a faculty that Aristotle calls a central sense, which unifies our various sensations into the perception of a single object. So, meaning, I could go, cover your head so that you can't see anywhere, disorient you, go stick you in a random place, and go take you to like a barn and put a horse behind you.
Okay.
And so there you are, maybe you're not looking at it, but you can feel it breathing on you, you can hear the sounds it's making, you can smell the smells of it, and your central sense puts this image together, this perception of what's actually going on around you. So you have a notion of what's going on around you that is communicated to you by all your various senses. Like even when I look this way, in my view of what's going on in this classroom, I still have a notion of the projector running, because even if I can't see it, I can hear it running. And maybe I can feel a little bit of the light on my skin. And so we create a perception through our central sense of everything that's going on. So our senses communicate a bunch of sense data to us, we're getting all this various sense data, but it's all composed together into one perception.
And is this how we comprehend reality, according to Aristotle?
So the external world is communicated to you through all your various senses. Sometimes the same thing is communicated through various senses, sometimes one thing through one sense, but you take all that sense data together to reproduce just one perception. You use those perceptions then to create concepts, concepts to create propositions, propositions to create arguments, and arguments to create sciences. So it's the foundation of all knowledge. How you come to know anything. It starts with sense data.
Oh, so it's not comprehending reality, it's coming to learn.
Same thing in Aristotle's mind.
Okay.
And the only thing you can learn about is reality. So remember, in his mind, logic, math, and the basic laws of the universe are all together.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long time. Shortly after him, we have Euclid and Euclid's Elements. And there is not a view that Euclid's Elements and physics are somehow different. Geometry and physics are the same thing. Geometry just describes this universe. This notion of mathematics sets. Mathematics being true independent of our universe is a huge leap. First made by Gauss, which is 2,000 years after this. So the basic laws of logic, the basics in mathematics, and the basic truths about this universe are all about this universe. They're all tied together in Aristotle's view. So you can't learn about not reality.
I see.
Everything's about reality, about this universe, the way things actually are here. Okay, so along with the external sense and the central sense, Aristotle identifies an inner sense, which he includes in this memory and imagination, and then finally intellect, which we call mind. So I'm just giving you a hierarchy of all the major things in his psychology. So you have your outer senses, then your central sense, which put those things together into perceptions, and then you have your memory, which can remember those perceptions. You have your imagination, you can create new perceptions in just your mind, and then you have your intellect. And your intellect is going to be the reasoning part of you. We'll have a lot more to say about the intellect later, but fundamentally the intellect is split into two. It has two faculties. The intellect or the mind, I think I just call it the mind from here on out. The mind then has two faculties, one passive and the other active. The passive mind has the ability to take in or become any form. The active part has the ability to construct or make any form. And the active part is the part that Aristotle thinks is immortal. So this is the essence of you that continues after you die.
Okay.
Okay? So, quick recap on all the senses we have. I have my sense organs, which give me all the sense data out there. That goes to my central sense, which creates a perception. I can store it in my memory. I can apply imagination to it, right? I can take my perception of gold, I can take my perception well, perception of gold things, create a concept of gold. I could take my perception of mountain, create the concept of mountain, and put gold and mountain together in my imagination, create something like a gold mountain. Right?
Yeah.
And then the mind. The mind's the one that we're going to be most interested in from here on out. The other two are pretty obvious what they are. The mind has two parts. A passive part which can take in any form. And we'll get more into that later, but essentially, your mind is able to identify the forms of things. Maybe not necessarily their matter, but the form of them. And then the active part, which constructs new forms from existing forms. When the form gets in your brain, the active part can then work on it. And we'll break that down more. So outside of the mind, were there any questions about any of these? Because we're going to let the rest of them go and just focus on the mind.
I'm good.
Okay, so in thinking about thought, is that the next one? Yeah. Okay, in thinking about thought, Aristotle built upon his model for sensation, makes it very similar. Just as in sensation, the organ actually takes in the quality being sensed, so too in thought, your mind actually takes in the forms of the objects being perceived.
Okay.
So the same way that when I stick my hand into a bucket of ice, it takes in the coldness, and coldness actually is now in my hand. Similarly, when I look at that object and I see chair, my mind takes the form of chairness into it. And now chairness is in my mind while I'm looking and thinking about that chair. The form actually exists in my mind.
Is this like your child seeing a bunch of dogs and stuff?
Yes.
Okay.
So she takes the form off of that dog, takes the form off of that dog, takes the form off of that dog, and is able to mold those forms into the concept of dog and name it now. And then identify, take the form out of some other creature and see, yes, that fits the form of dog. So it must also be a dog.
Okay.
But you're extracting the form of things. You don't actually take in the matter when you look at that chair and you comprehend it's a chair. That's because you took in its form. You didn't take in any of the matter. I didn't stick any wood in your mouth. It's just a form. So, the organ actually takes in the, so too, in thought, your mind actually takes in the forms of the objects being perceived. They actually exist in your mind. That's where the form is.
Okay.
Another analogy that Aristotle gives to help us is in thinking about consumption. So think about you eating, what do I use? A carrot. When you eat a carrot, what happens? You take a carrot and you chew it and you break it down. That matter that made up the carrot is no longer in the form of the carrot when you eat it. And, assuming you use the whole carrot, that carrot actually becomes a part of you. And so the carrot lost its initial form and took on another form. So your body just took in the matter of the carrot, not the form. It left the form behind, so to speak, and just took in the matter of the carrot.
Okay.
Does that make sense? In similar way, with perception, your mind takes in the form and leaves behind the matter. Your mind absorbs the matter, or the form of the thing you're perceiving, rather than the matter. Consumption, you absorb the matter, not the form. Perception, you observe the form, you take in the form, not the matter. Make sense?
Yeah.
So, another analogy is thinking about consumption. When you eat a carrot, the matter of the carrot loses its form as the carrot becomes part of you. So consumption strips the form away from the matter and only takes in... Did I say it right?
Yep.
So consumption strips the form away from the matter and only takes in the matter. There should be form there. Similarly, in abstract thought, the mind takes in the form of the carrot and leaves behind the matter. So I think that makes sense, right? And where does it take it in? It takes it into that passive part of your mind. That's what we meant by the passive part of your mind. It now exists in the passive part of your mind. Passive, meaning it can be acted upon by external things.
Does it get into how the active mind works?
Kind of.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard to have a rigorous science of psychology. Anyways, so that's how we view thought. Therefore, thinking is a process of literally taking in the forms of things. My passive mind actually takes in the form of things and incorporates them into your mind.
Okay.
And thereby becoming more formed in mind. That's what you do when you take in the forms. your mind becomes more forms as you keep adding these forms to your internal state of all the forms that you've ever taken in. Your whole systematic body of knowledge is just a bunch of forms. Right? That's the same thing Plato said from the beginning. What can we know? We can know forms. That's all we can know.
Well, this is just looking at your reality of things, but what about thinking about something else that isn't part of your immediate reality?
Give me an example.
What if you think about a concept, like an abstract concept?
Any example.
Hope.
Hope. How did you come to know hope?
Yeah, how did you come to know hope?
So when you came to know hope, it probably was you saw people in difficult situations that you came to know difficult. That's one that there's going to be a lot of chain reactions there for someone to finally come to hope. But the point is you had all these experiences over and over again, and you were told the word to communicate with a person that was hoping, and so you came across in a sense data. If I put you in a vacuum so that you never had access to all that data before and then told you or asked you to tell me about hope, you couldn't do it. It ultimately started from those senses. Now hope isn't something that you can really define for me, so that's not one I can really work with. But if you had a concept like one, how does a kid first learn how one is? Right? Something you sometimes ask an algebra student, what's one? Really stump them. They might do this, saying, no, that's one finger, I just want to know what one is. And so how did you come to know one? I showed you one finger, I showed you one piece of chalk, I showed you one da-da-da-da-da, and you absorbed just the form one from that one matter, whatever the matter was. And you took that into your mind. And now you have one in your mind. And you created a concept of one from that form, and you can now use that concept of one. You can now use that form. And then I give you the concept of two as double one, which is another form, and you take that form into your mind. And your mind becomes more informed. As you take these forms in and integrate them with your mind.
So all learning is taking in the data.
It's taking in those forms.
Okay.
It's almost identical now with what Plato was saying with his forms. It's creating this logical structure of these forms.
So Aristotle really didn't disagree with Plato all that much.
He disagreed with Plato a lot because he says Plato has a wrong starting place. Plato's fundamental axiom was, the universe is knowable. That was his basic axiom. The universe is knowable. And so then he asked, if the universe is knowable, what does it have to be? The things that we know are forms. The universe has to be forms. Everything we see around us isn't forms. So we're not part of the real universe. And you see how Plato's reasoning goes on from there.
Yeah.
Aristotle never disagreed that what we ultimately know are forms, what we ultimately know are universals. That's undisputed. Any information you tried to tell anyone about Donald Timpson would be some sort of universal. What could you tell people about me? I'm 5'9", that's universal. I'm a teacher, I have brown hair. What can you tell them? All the information you can tell them about me are universals, which are forms. The universal is a form, right?
Okay.
You are a particular of a type. Everything's a particular of a type. There's no such thing as pure matter, pure potentiality, because then it's actually nothing. If it's potentially anything, it's actually nothing. So, everything in this universe has form. And so that's how we come to know things, is because of the form that they're in. That's what we know. So all knowledge is based in these forms. And your mind is able to learn because it can take in these forms. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot more sense.
Okay, so you take these forms in, incorporate them into your mind, and thereby becoming more formed in mind, or becoming informed or well-informed, or taking in information, things that can possibly become forms in a human mind. That's what information is, things that inform the mind. It's where we get all our notions of all the different ways we use that inform. Talking about Aristotle's theory of learning. It's at the root of a lot of the ways we naturally talk about things. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so the mind, the passive part of the mind, is potentially capable of receiving and constructing all forms. You with me?
Yeah.
In other words, all things can potentially be known by the mind. Good?
Okay.
You can your mind can take it in any form, so you can potentially know anything in the universe. It's possible to know anything in the universe, the form of anything. So if we accept this as a basic premise of the mind, we're now going to explore what the mind must be like.
Okay.
Okay, that's what we're doing here. What must the nature of the mind then be? The passive part can have no pre-existing structure of its own. This is kind of a bit of a technical argument dealing with later philosophers down the road, which is why it's emphasized in Aristotle more than probably he would have, but worth going through. So what must the nature of the mind then be? The passive part can have no pre-existing structure of its own. It has to come in tabula rasa, as a blank slate, is the way Aristotle described it. Now, if the human mind had prior structure, and since all information must be understood by the human mind, that's the part of that's where you make judgments, that's where you decide what's true and what's false. It's through the mind. All information ultimately comes through the mind, and the mind is the part that makes the judgments.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So if your mind already had some pre-existing structure to it, then the prior structure of the human mind would dictate our perceptions and conclusions. If there was some pre-existing structure to your mind that it just already had, then whatever that pre-existing structure was would affect how you see and observe everything, and all the conclusions you could possibly come to.
Okay.
Right? We'd then be forced to say, in reference to some perceived fact, that it may be true for humans, but we have to think that due to the structure of our minds. In other words, if there were this pre-existing structure to our minds, then we can't claim that we can know anything. We can only know what the structure of our mind predetermined to allow us to know. And our minds might just be so structured as to make us think that 1 + 1 is 2. That might have nothing to do with reality. It's like I could write a computer program that anytime you plugged in 1 + 5, it spit out 2. And the computer program has no choice in the matter because of the structure I gave it. And it has to spit that out. It can't do anything else, even though that's false. I can make it spit out 1 + 1 is 5. I can make it spit out 1 + 1 is 2. And the structure I give the program determines the answer it's going to spit out.
Yeah.
In similar way, if our mind had some pre-existing structure, then all we can know is what the structure of the mind allows us to know. And so, how else can I say that? And so it could be, so all we could conclude is our minds are so structured as to enable us to come to the conclusion that 1 + 1 is 2. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. In other words, it disconnects what we claim with reality, if there's some pre-existing structure.
And he says that there isn't?
He says that there isn't any pre-existing structure. It may be true for humans, but we have to think that due to the structure of our minds. That's what some objection could be to some fact of reality. In other words, it disconnects our conclusions about reality from reality itself. Maybe they happen to align, maybe they don't. Maybe when I type that computer program, it spits out 1 + 1 is 5. Maybe it spits out 1 + 1 is 2. Maybe it spits out truth, maybe not. It doesn't have a choice in the matter. It can only do what its structure allows it to do.
Okay.
So this then, so it disconnects our conclusions about reality from reality itself and makes all knowledge now subjective. We can only say the way it's known to us. We can't say what the knowledge is in and of itself.
Yeah.
And so, if you try to accept this type of argument, this then undercuts itself. If the mind has structure, then we cannot know for sure that the mind has structure.
So contradiction?
Not a contradiction. We're not going to have a position where we can prove or disprove this. All he's going to show is that the mind having structure undercuts itself.
Yeah.
So ultimately, Immanuel Kant is going to take this exact position, that the mind comes with some pre-existing structure, it's going to have its transcendental categories, and a contemporary of his day is going to prove him wrong, but not publish, because he doesn't want to get caught up in politics, namely Gauss. Because one of the things, giving an example of what this pre-existing structure might be, Immanuel Kant tried to say part of the pre-existing structure of our brain is basically the axioms of Euclidean geometry. He built that into some of the structure of our brain. Our minds just happens to have the structure where the axioms of Euclidean geometry are just baked into it. And so we can only understand things through Euclidean geometry. It's somehow built into our mind. And someone came around and discovered that there's not just Euclidean geometries, there's other geometries, and they're just as valid, which throws this whole notion, we can know something that wasn't part of the structure of our mind, therefore that can't be part of the structure of our mind.
Oh, I see.
That's how we undercut it. So any argument like this undercuts itself. So if you decide that you're going to take the position, well, we can't know for sure, well, I'll just say how I said here. If the mind has structure, then we cannot know for sure that the mind has structure. We have to come to the conclusion the mind is so structured as to make us think that the mind has structure. You can't say you know it.
When you say it undercuts itself, do you mean
It's kind of like,
put limits on itself?
yeah, it makes the argument you're saying, I can instantly say you can't know that. Give me an example of an argument that undercuts itself. Someone says all truth is subjective. You with me? Someone says all truth is subjective. Is that statement subjective? There's made a universal statement. The statement undercuts itself.
Yeah.
So that's what we mean by the argument undercuts itself. And it makes anyone who holds the argument can't even validly hold the argument. There's no way for them to validate their conclusion. Okay. So that was kind of a weird little tangent. Getting back to some of the passive part of the mind now. Now the passive part of the mind seems to be pure potentiality and so capable of taking on any form. Now this is a weird thing and I couldn't get it resolved because earlier in the metaphysics there is no matter without form, there is no pure potentiality. And it seems like here Aristotle has pure potentiality existing. And so I don't know what to make of that. And a lot of his psychological positions we're missing a lot of chunks of it. And so there's a ton of speculation about it. So one of the things that there's a lot of speculation about is whether or not Aristotle really believed in an afterlife. Because there's some fragments there that make it seem like the active part of the soul, which we'll get to here in a second, he seems to be arguing that that persists forever. But then there's other interpretations and ways of thinking about that maybe that's not the case.
Okay.
And specifically with his psychology. And so, in particular with his psychology, it seems like there's a lot of inconsistencies in him, but it's one of the places where we have the least for what we're trying to piece together. So, just as best I can with what I got, the passive part of the mind seems to be pure potentiality and so capable of taking on any form. If it can take on any form, if it can actualize any form in it, then it's pure potentiality. And maybe it doesn't actualize any form since there's no matter there, and so maybe that's how he would say it.
Doesn't that mean it can potentially be anything?
It can potentially have any form, but then there's no matter to this mind.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So there's no matter to this mind. So I guess it's not matter without form, so maybe that's okay. But it's pure potentiality without any matter to it, which seems weird. Pure potentiality without any matter to it, and it can actually be any form. But once again, without any matter.
Yeah.
I can potentially have the form of chair in my mind, and then I can actually have the form of chair in my mind. But I don't actually have a chair in my mind. Just as form. So maybe that's somehow how we get out of that, to say there's no matter without form, but there's form without matter, namely the prime mover. So maybe that's the right way to think about it. Now, getting to his argument for the active part of the mind. Because this is so far just the passive part of the mind, the part of the mind that can potentially be anything. So he thought there had to be two parts to the mind, the passive part and then the active part. Since no potentiality can actualize itself, and the passive part of the mind is just pure potentiality, the mind also has to have an active part that is responsible for actualizing those potentialities. Part of you that forces you to think somehow. The part of you that forces you to pay attention to that chair somehow and make your mind take on the form of that chair.
Okay.
Kind of a weird split up there, right? like some sort of will part into you, that actualizing part is somehow like the agency of you, the part that can make choices, decisions.
So it's like you have your own prime mover within you, in your mind?
Kinda.
Okay.
So the active part is a reasoning agency. And now it existed before the body and will persist beyond the death of the body. Now what exactly it looks outside the death of the body, he doesn't hardly give anything about. Aristotle had very little to say about any sort of notion of a pre-existence or any sort of notion of a afterlife, as we call it. He was very much focused on just describing this universe.
In all of his works, right?
In all of his works, right. His ethics isn't, you need to live life this way so that when you die, you have a wonderful immortality from there on out as you're up in heaven. His ethics is, you want to live the happiest life possible, here's how. He's not saying this makes you happier when you're dead. He's saying here's how to live a happy life. Okay. Remember, Aristotle is a philosopher focused on the here and now. And so has very little to say about any sort of pre-existence or afterlife. Good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think ending with this psychology, that's a pretty good place to end it, and we can start ethics next time. Any questions about anything? Nothing?
I'm good.
Okay. So we can still continue, can end the lecture. We can still meet just next week as normal.